Hello. It's a great pleasure tonight to introduce you all to to welcome you all to the Ethel M Wood Lecture in the University of London. Most of you will know very well about the Ethel M Wood Lecture, usually known as the Ethel, but some of you might not. So I suppose I should tell you that it's an annual lecture in the University of London, which was endowed in 1947 by Mrs Ethel M Wood. Mrs Ethel M Wood. It's administered jointly at present between King's College London and Heythrop College, University of London, and is kept in the departments of theology and religious studies at King's and whatever we call ourselves at Heythrop on any given occasion. Possibly the only interesting thing about Mrs Wood, apart from her desire to fund a lecture for students and informed members of the general public, and indeed to give a large number of Bibles to the university, was that she insisted that the content of the lecture shouldn't be controversial, something we have ignored to good effect ever since. Which brings me to Joran. Joran, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. This is Professor Joran Auckland, who some of us know very well from her time in the Department of Biblical Studies at Sheffield. But she's done much more than that. You could say that Joran is the sort of woman who makes things happen. She is currently Professor of Gender Studies in the Humanities at the University of Oslo, and is also Director of the Norwegian Institute at Athens, where she tells me she rides a bicycle, which sounds unwise. She started out with a degree in classics. She's worked in the philosophy department, and since then she's never been quite sure what she's doing. She's been in the biblical studies department at Sheffield, and rather think she might move on to law at some stage, heaven forbid. She is a founding co-editor of the Journal of the Bible and its Reception, a translator and member of the Translation Committee of the Norwegian Bible Society, and a member of the SBL Council. Some of us well remember her English language monograph, Women in Their Place, Paul and the Corinthian Discourse of Gender and Sanctuary Space. We're less familiar with her book on Paul in Norwegian. But apart from that, she has two recent journal issues on theories of masculinity in the Bible, and her volume on biblical spatiality in the sacred is out in the spring. But what you really need to know about Joran is that she's a fearsome keeper of chickens and used to keep ducks as well, and I have photographic evidence of her dealing with the hawk that got the ducks, so I wouldn't get in the way if I were you. We're delighted to welcome you, Joran, tonight to give a lecture that strikes fear into the heart of anyone who comes from New Zealand. Paul translated a seismogram of changes in 20th century understandings of gender. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, and also thank you so much for giving me this great honor to present this lecture here today. I was quite happy when I was reading more about Ethel Wood and her interest in the English Bible, and because I gave the topic before I knew very much about her, but then when I realized what her interests were, I thought that perhaps talking about translation, and especially into English, was in her spirit in that sense. The introductory quote here is from the prefaces to the Valla annotations to the New Testament by Erasmus. And Erasmus says that I wish that the women or housewives might read the Gospels and the epistles of Paul. So it's important that they can do so. I wish that they might be translated into all tongues of all people, so that not only the Scots and the Irish, but also the Turk and the Saracen might read and understand. So the issue of translation is there quite early on, and an interesting extra twist here is that in the only official or printed translation of this that I have seen, Muliercula was not translated with anything feminine, women, etc., but it was translated humble, which kind of sends us directly into what I will be talking about today. Translation is one of the primary means by which cultures travel. It is in a culture's meeting with new and different worlds that change and transformation occur. Today, there is a growing awareness in the humanities that the very nature of culture is translative. Europe is created through processes of translation, and in these processes, the Charter document has indisputably been the Bible in general and the New Testament in particular. It could be argued that the parting of the ways between early or rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity happened because of disagreement over the possibility of translation of sacred scripture. Early Christians utilized the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was not acceptable to the rabbis. Next, it could be argued that the inherent missionary command to spread the word until the ends of the earth contributed to making Christianity hegemonic. In contrast to the inherent theories of intranslatability of the Quran, for example, or the Torah, which means that knowledge of original languages is far more important in the interpretive communities surrounding these sacred texts. The Christian sacred scripture itself insists on being spread and adapted to various circumstances. It contains stories of God's Spirit, enabling people to speak different languages, yet witnessing to the one and only God's deeds of power. Acts of the Apostles 21. The theory of language inherent in these and similar New Testament stories presupposes a very positive view of translatability. In turn, the belief that God's deeds and the Christian message can be communicated in all languages and transported into all sorts of cultural situations has produced a kind of universalism that helped spread not only the core Christian message, but also the cultures that identified with it, for better and for worse. In his 2009 RBL review of the second edition of the Writings of St. Paul, presented by Wayne Meeks and John Fitzgerald in the Norton Critical Edition series, George Shillington generally lauds the timely revision and expansion that the new edition represents. He says, Pauline scholarship has come a long way since 1972, the fruit of which is admirably reflected in this updated work. But the first item he picks out as especially noteworthy is the use of a new Bible translation in the rendering of Paul's writings in English. He says, whereas the Revised Standard Version, RSV, was the text for the first edition, today's New International Version was the editor's choice for the second edition. The reasons given for the choice of this are because of its relatively conservative mode of translation, while aiming for both inclusiveness and accuracy in the representation of gender, unquote. Given the editor's concern about bias in the interpretation of the Pauline texts, one wonders why they would have chosen a translation that is avowedly Protestant evangelical in orientation. In view of the fact that Meeks used the RSV for his first edition, a logical choice, one would think, would have been the new Revised Standard Version, which also adopts gender-inclusive language responsibly, says Shillington. Out of this, then, grew a longer discussion. The brief quote illustrates what I will be discussing today, the connections between Paul, translation, and gender politics, specifically how gender inclusivity, neutrality, or lack of such has become the number one parameter in discussions at the interface of church, religion, and society at large, and also in the estimations of whether a new Bible translation is liberal or conservative. How did it get to this? I will start with Elizabeth Cady Stanton around the turn of the previous century, because as a liberal in every way, living in the period of real liberal theology, but without erudite knowledge of original languages, she may serve as a good example where concordant, liberal, and gender in translation are heaped together, versus more conservative translations that pay more heed to tradition in translation, perpetuating an image of patriarchal biblical norms of gender as original, irresistible, and untouchable. My examples will be drawn then from Pauline literature. Gender equality. The possibility of thinking gender equality and equal worth in the ancient and medieval worlds were limited, since numerous scholars have demonstrated how everything, especially gender, was thought in hierarchical relations. The mathematical and eventually philosophical sign and idea of equality was imported into Europe from Arabic mathematics in the 16th century. Before that, most terms that come close to what we mean by equality today, for example the term homonoia, usually signify a form of unity that still does not abolish hierarchy. We should therefore not expect to find the value of equality in the Pauline letters, although surprisingly many still do so. At the beginning of the Enlightenment process, from 1670 onwards, the biblical texts on anthropology and gender were still formative in legislation, debate, and cultural habit. Gradually, the context of legitimation and ultimate appeal changed, so that by the end of the Enlightenment process, the Bible was dethroned in some circles, while in other circles one tried to preserve its relevance from within the new episteme by reading it in light of the new ideas. On the other hand, I have argued before that the secular value and concept of gender equality was developed in Enlightenment conversations and contestations over sacred scriptures. This change means that what we today would label feminist arguments were developed in debates over sacred scriptures, but eventually given a new rationale in notions of the innate rights of man of the 20th century. The relative emphasis on each of the Enlightenment values of liberty, equality, and brotherhood or community, respectively, has shifted historically and from society to society. In Norway, it seems that gender equality is currently ranked even above the value of liberty, not lagging far behind in other European countries either, according to the European Value Survey. There is a difference between the current project, which is a study of culture, of values in a comparative way, and the inclusive language project in Bible translation that many of you have probably heard about. So perhaps the most important project in the inclusive language department, and a huge contribution towards exposing the gender bias inherent in Bible translation over the centuries, is the German Bibel in gerechter Sprache. I have put this under German, under Norwegian. That's just to kind of have the non-English translations on one page. So, yeah. This edition will, in this lecture, also represent the probably latest development that I will be mentioning, being published less than 10 years ago. The translation is primarily an academic one, building on the latest gender-critical biblical research. It is also a constructive theological project, and by this I mean constructive in the North American sense, and theology in the sense of a comprehensive normative project, including both biblical studies, systematic theology, ethics, philosophy of religion, and church history. This means, among other things, that the translation is an expression of the deep belief that the Bible is itself based on justice as a core value, which is fair enough, and that with correct translations of the Bible, it will more visibly come out as such. As Frank Krusemann, one of the founding fathers, one could say, of this project, he says in 2013, Gerechtigkeit ist der rote Faden, der durch die gesamte Bibel führt und ihre Vielfalt zusammenhält. So, justice is the red scarlet thread that goes through the whole of the Bible and holds its multiplicity together. I think this is a relatively modern idea. But the biblical term of tzedakah and dikaiosynne are undisputably very central terms in the Bible. But what exactly these terms mean have changed over time. So what is meant with gerechte Sprache? It's quite synonymous to what in English is inclusive language. For a democratic church wanting to be inclusive, this is undoubtedly a good idea, and the translation can work well. But any biblical scholar will know that there is not much gender or ethnic inclusivity in neither the Old nor the New Testaments. Translations should not make it worse, as they have often done, but there is also a problem if they try to cover it up. It can lead to severe misunderstandings of the texts. And as my first example, I will go to Galatians 4. This is a text I have chosen because I used it with students when I was teaching in Sheffield. I was giving the students Galatians 3 and to 4 to work on from a gender perspective. The students did not understand why they should have a look at Galatians 4, because on the basis of this New Revised Standard Version of the text, there was not, why should this be strange in a gender perspective? As long as New Revised Standard Version talks about heirs in a neutral sense, the English language students, because you could, unfortunately, in that program, opt to take the classes on the basis of English-only versions of the New Testament. So it was difficult in English to see the problem. Not until they consulted other translations did they see what the problem was. I am all in favor of gender equality in the church, but I am also a scholar of gender in ancient worlds and languages, and the two do not always go well together. For teaching and learning about these matters, literal translations are in fact much better. So I will just jump a little bit here. It is probably no coincidence that the Bibel in gerechte Sprache appeared in German. In English, inclusivity is less of a problem than in Germanic languages, since English does not have grammatical genders. So for inclusivity, that is a very good thing. For understanding what's at stake in the Greek, which has grammatical genders, it's perhaps not so good. As Ron Milton points out in his Gender Inclusive Bible Translations article from 2003, I quote, "A gender-inclusive translation seeks to translate Hebrew and Greek gender-generic words, mostly nouns and pronouns, with equally generic English words. English frequently uses masculine terms generically, but gender-inclusive translations avoid this practice." In a note, he specifies that gender-inclusive is not the same as gender-neutral or gender-generic, and he continues in the main text. "It is important to emphasize that every translation uses some gender-inclusive language," he says. "The use of gender-inclusive language is appropriate when the original text also does so. The problem arises in extreme gender-inclusive versions that go far beyond what the original languages of Scripture allow. On the other hand, there are places where mild increases of gender-inclusive language may make a translation more accurate and consistent," unquote. As an example of the latter, he mentions John 6:51. In King James Version it says, "If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever." Milton points out that the English man paraphrases the Greek pronoun signifying anyone, tis, which can denote both males and females. The early modern translation has turned this into male form. To study Bible translations with an eye to gender in the modern therefore develops into a story of how gender-generic Greek in the early period was translated into gender-specific English, and how in later years the attempts are more to translate gender-generic Greek into gender-generic English. But what about gender-specific Greek that favored the term brothers, for example? Should that be translated into equally gender-specific English or into gender-generic English? So the term used to denote the mainly male recipients of Paul's letters inclusive of any present females and others. But these did not deserve any special mention. The term was translated into brothers through our brethren we have. It used to denote the mainly male recipients. At some point, brothers was seen as too gender specific. The addition "and sisters" served to intensify the gender specific character of the masculine term, and we have that in the New International Version and the NRSV. The Norwegian equivalent of the NRSV, the Norwegian Bible from 2011, went in the opposite direction. Norwegian has a frequently used word for siblings, søsken, used as translation for brothers, but søsken is inclusive of both brothers and sisters, and much more commonly used than siblings in English. That's why it was not, particularly noticeable. So whereas the English modern brothers and sisters becomes too gender specific, søsken becomes too generic, and then only theoretical discussions of the invisible inclusion of female under male can help us out further here, or at least point us in direction of the problematic sides of both translations. So there is not one correct and one wrong translation here, but both of them will have their advantages and disadvantages. If we go back in time, and now I have used a couple of examples as illustrations of more of the theoretical issues I've raised. If we go back in time, we can start with the English translations of the 19th century, late 19th century. In 1876, Julia Smith published the Holy Bible containing the Old and New Testaments, translated literally from the original tongues. I haven't actually seen this translation. It's on my list, my reading list. In a study of institutions, of transfer of mainstream social values, this translation is perhaps not the most important, but I mention it because it is lurking in the background of much of the further development. Because in 1881, I should probably jump back a little bit here, because in 1881 we had the English Revised Version, and the American Standard Version is a very slight revision of this text from 1901, and this is a relatively concordant translation. In between these two editions, the English and the American version, the Woman's Bible was published. The Woman's Bible emerged partly because Elizabeth Cady Stanton found that Christian churches had canonized male supremacist interpretations of the Bible that were more denigrating for women than the biblical text itself, and partly because she was disappointed with a recent all-male committee commissioned by the Church of England to make the first major Bible revision since the King James Version of 1611, and especially for their failure to consult the already mentioned biblical scholar Julia Smith. Still, Cady Stanton had hoped for a new version in which old translation errors in women's disfavor had been eliminated, a hope that was not fulfilled when the revised version appeared. And so she has a go at this in the introduction to her Woman's Bible. Cady Stanton envisaged a more profound revision, correcting translation errors and presenting updated and unbiased interpretations were not enough. So a feminist critique was necessary in order to, in her words, correct false teaching and acts of injustice to women, and to create an expurgated edition of the liturgies and the scriptures. So what she wanted was something far more than what we would call a Bible translation. Then there is the Revised Standard Version of 1946, purportedly a revision of the American Standard Version from 1901, but much more idiomatic than its predecessor. And then it's the NRSV from 1989, already mentioned in the introduction. According to a survey done by the Society of Biblical Literature in 2010 with 1,500 respondents, NRSV was the most preferred translation for both academic and liturgical use, by its US English-speaking members. 83% of respondents used the NRSV. So it's in a way the professor's choice. In fact, they were so happy with it that 57% thought that it did not need to be updated or revised. Those who did think it needed update pointed towards research at the interface between biblical studies and translation, namely new archaeological and textual findings, advances in translation theory, that English usage has changed, and some poor or inaccurate cases of translations that have been discovered in the text. This general satisfaction with the NRSV does not reflect the satisfaction with this edition in the population of the US at large. So I have included some quotes here from the Woman's Bible, the introduction. I will just skip much of that. It's about Julia Smith and why she should have been included in the revision committee, according to Katie Stanton. And that Katie Stanton accuses the male translator of making the Bible worse in English than it was in Hebrew or Greek in terms of gender. So what we see, the guiding values of her text is that the Bible translation should enable emancipation of women. It should enable equality. And it should rectify the, in her opinion, mistakes made in the revised version. I should also mention, before I move on to the case studies, say that at times, or if you want to if you want to do this at home, just be aware that on the websites of the various Bible societies, you are not necessarily given the historical versions as they were published. Because the Bible societies have a dual mission. They are also missionary societies, so they want to present the best possible versions of their text, so sometimes it's corrected. And in the Norwegian case, for example, the previous translation from 1978 has received much criticism. So what is published as the 1978 edition on the internet is not actually the 1978 edition that you will find if you have a physical copy of it, but it includes numerous corrections from the 1990s. So just be aware of this, and it's something that makes this field quite hard at the moment. And a project in digital humanities and historical translations of the Bible would have been quite interesting. Young people, I'm not going to do this, so it's just if someone has an interest in this, I think that might be a good project. So for now, the safest thing is to have the hard copy. Yeah, okay. This now we have I was trying to check that everything would come up here in the proper Greek, but here is something, this machine does not, this probably was inserted from another machine, because I have made sure that I will type on my Greek computer and then it looks okay, but this one doesn't. So I'm sorry about that. My first case is Romans 16 and the case of Unia. For centuries, this name Unia was by some scholars understood as a male name, Unias, and translated or described as such. The problem is that the male name Unias is not documented in the ancient world or in the same period as Paul wrote his letter, whereas the female name Unia was quite common. The issue, whether this is a man or woman, came up because of modern historical criticism, coupled with feminism. And for a long time, I assumed that Bernadette Bruton, in her article Unia Outstanding Among the Apostles, was the first one to address this issue. But actually it happened much earlier. both in Norway and in the Woman's Bible. What Bruton does is to demonstrate how Unia became male in the medieval period and how it remained so more or less until the 20th century. This is a story that I'm going to interrupt. So Bruton does this by contrasting a quote from the Church Fathers with one from the Pontifical Biblical Mission from 1976, to which she reacts with her article. And they say, also notable is the case of Unias or Unio, placed in the rank of the apostles, with regard to whom one or another raises the question of whether it is a man. And then Bruton herself adds, what a striking contrast the exegesis of Romans 16:7 has practically reversed. Whereas for John Chrysostom, the apostle addressed by Paul is a woman by the name of Unia, for almost all modern scholars it is a man, Unias, whom Paul is greeting. But there is a sea of interpreters between them, holding all sorts of different views. It is the link to the apostle term that led people to read a female grammatical form as male. Bruton continues by explaining the linguistic speculations through which a hypothetical masculine name, Junius, was perceived as a short form of Unianus, etc. But in the longer run, all professional commentators, or many professional commentators, came to see the name Unian to be Unias, an unattested form elsewhere. However, looking into this, the story is much more complicated than Bruton presents it as. In the first print editions of the Greek text, so this is Erasmus' critical Greek text of 1516, the feminine form of the name appeared. This continued to be the custom until the 13th edition of the Nestlé in 1927-28, the first edition that Eberhard Sonn published, the first one to leave the majority reading, the first to include minuscules, in short, a large step in a scientific direction. And that's when Unia also disappeared out. He chose the masculine form without even mentioning this in the critical apparatus. Unias remained masculine there until 1998, when the edition gender bended back again and the masculine was dropped, even as an alternative. Also in the Norwegian translations of the 20th century, Unias was male. And to keep the continuity going through this paper, in the New International Version, the apostle is female, a change from the previous New International Version. And we see that the Vulgate-based translation from 2013 still has Unias, the male reading, and the King James Version has female, Unia. And this is significant. What many of the translations do then is that they relate it to a Greek text with a female name. They translated this as female, but they treat it as a textual error and read it as a man, or they just assume, without thinking about the material text, that it is a male apostle, or they simply don't see it, which I will return to. In Norway, there was an important, or she was important but marginalized, a philologist called Martha Steinsvik, in the beginning of the 20th century. She was an erudite philologist with knowledge of Assyrian, Old Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and several other ancient languages. And her importance is that she supplied the members of the parliament with linguistic and historical knowledge and arguments in favor of women priests in written form and accessible to the politicians. Steinsvik mentions Prisca, Phoebe, and Unia as women with prominent and leading positions within the church already in a writing from 1917. So she says that Unia had, in Norwegian Bible translations, been transformed into the man Unias. The reason was that the Bible translators could not imagine a woman being characterized as apostle. And who does she draw on as her witness? John Chrysostom, who she had, of course, read, and who also Bruton uses 50 years later. In the Norwegian Parliament, someone had picked up this discussion by Steinsvik and the quote from John Chrysostom, but the conservative side there, those who wanted to keep the priesthood closed for women, they accused the other side of falsifying the quotes from John Chrysostom, which is quite interesting. Also, if we go even further back, also the Woman's Bible mentions Junia as female. So this is in the 1890s. We have two comments here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself is clearly not aware of this, but Ellen Patel Dietrich is. And the fact that you have both statements in the same volume on this shows the lack of editing of the Woman's Bible. It is an ad hoc, very much a ad hoc writing. This is a clip from the record of the Norwegian parliamentary debates, just to show you how this worked. I'm sure you probably cannot read it, apart from Joan perhaps, but here we have. Does it work? Can you see? Yeah. Here you have Junia. Also being discussed in the Norwegian Parliament, which is, so this is in a way a curiosity, but it shows both the importance of translation of this term and also how important Märtha Steinsvik's work was in this situation. Also, Märtha Steinsvik discusses 1 Corinthians 14 and whether women could speak in the assembly. In her text from 1917, she opens that with a declaration that women and men are self-evidently equal, and that this also extends to the priesthood. And then I have also included the parliamentary debates here, because again, based on Märtha Steinsvik's work, you have then the English and the French translations of the same verse quoted in the parliament, and then as the record here shows. So you probably can recognize, you have, here it is. So here is but for comparison, here is how it is in the English translation, and then in the Parliament they say, well, it's better in English because of the way it's the various sections of the verse is put together, and also in French. But if we return to the previous one, there is discussion of the term la laine, but also the translations differ whether the women want to know something, whether they want to learn, and then the New International Version whether they want to inquire about something. So maybe the New International Version there has the strongest expression that they want to inquire about something. There's something they want to find out. So it's the most active one on the part of women. In the Norwegian translation of 2011, you have the term tale, which is more like the German reden, which is in contrast to sprechen in German, or snakke in Norwegian. So there is a distinction between different ways of speaking. And then the discussion in the parliament and in Steinsvik is whether it would be more kind of chatting or kind of giving a speech. And she says that it's really the chatting that Paul tries to do away with. So that's why she would suggest that that it should be snakke, and also the latest Norwegian translation follows this. But given her knowledge of other languages, she starts to talk about that it really goes back etymologically to the grasshoppers kind of sounds that they make when they do this with their wings, and so she takes it all back to kind of a couple of thousand years before or something like that. It's quite fascinating to read. And then she just concludes her long explanation of the etymology of the term lalain with, see all Greek dictionaries. So this is what they also goes out to the Norwegian Parliament. So they were throwing Greek dictionaries around when they were discussing this point. And then they were stopped by the President of the Parliament saying that this is actually not a theological disputation. Then we have, we have also a few other examples that I will go through very quickly, also demonstrating how terms in the Pauline letters have been translated in different ways and how reflect different things, different views on gender. You have the term andridsetste, which is related to the root of aner, man. The English Standard Version has act like men. The King James Version, quit you like men. New Revised Standard Version, which is the more inclusive version, says be courageous. And the Vulgate-based version, do manfully. And then the Norwegian translation, the latest, is very close to the NRSV again. Be brave, vær modige. I guess again that the liturgical and the academic translations may go in different directions. I think it is a problem if every association with the masculinity here is kind of glossed over. And by translating be courageous or be brave, you only emphasize that side of the term and lose out its linked to masculinity. Similarly, we have the term, we have Phoebe here. How is she, her function, her office described? In Phillips, she is described as a deaconess, which is an office that we know from the modern world, often health and pastoral service. The ESV has servant of the church, which is a more submissive position. And then you have the douairins, which is the Vulgate-based, and then a sister who is in the ministry of the church, which could be a prominent Catholic nun who is having an important office, but at the side of the priesthood. King James Version also has a servant, and then again Norwegian and NRSV has that it's a deacon, because there is a deacon's office also in the Norwegian church, so it's an important office in its own right. Trophos is also interesting, because here we have the oldest version, King James, a nurse cherisheth her children, and then we have the ESV, a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So here it's clear that you should not work as a nurse nursing the other people's children, but it's a mother who actually nurses herself. Same with the New International Version, a nursing mother cares for her children. NRSV, a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. It's a bit ambiguous. Is this, children she has given birth to, or is it those who she nurses? And then the Phillips has that of a devoted nurse among her babies. So here it's more kind of a professional job again. And of course, whether it's considered good or not so good, that that a baby is nursed by someone else than the mother has varied very much historically, and you can also read this through these sample translations. This is not in terms of kind of men and women, but it's very, just very briefly also how the term malakos, this is a separate lecture really, but also here we see that translations will choose very different words to render this term in English, and also if the term is used in 1 Corinthians and in Matthew, where it's clearly about clothing, then the translation will differ. So Renato Links has recently argued that why don't we translate it to soft also in 1 Corinthians 6? How can we be so sure that this is about homosexual men? I'm drawing to a close. In translation, something is lost and something is added. This is inevitably so because languages are different and the translator has to make many choices. To me, it's a bit, I shouldn't say depressing, but I think that there is a huge area here that many biblical scholars should pay more attention to. By studying translations critically, one can read over time how the values guiding the translator's choices are changing. Increased rights and liberties for women during the 20th century has changed our views on gender. It is now to such an extent seen as a common good that equality is among the highest ranked European values. This development can also be traced in translations of Paul of the same period. But it is interesting to note that it kind of got worse before it got better. Both in the Nestle Greek Testament and the translations, Junia was more definitely turned into a man in the modern period because the tide changed towards the end, or before the tide changed towards the end of the 20th century. As long as gender was not so high on the agenda, it was not seen as the grammatical form, that the grammatical form and the name was female. It was only when it became contested ground that something had to be done about it, and then reversed. Our interest in gender, then, has made gender more contested ground, which in turn can produce a new fallacy, that we overlook the variation in the manuscripts and translations of previous periods. So this is my criticism towards Bernadette Bruton, who draws a very sharp distinction between then and now. But she should be credited for being the one who introduces the topic into modern scholarship. Junia was there in the text of Erasmus and in the translation of the King James. However, as long as a woman in this place was not dans le vrai, to use Foucault's term, we see it only when we become sensitized to the problematic issues surrounding it. Along the same lines, the Norwegian Parliament, only late in the 19th century, specified that public servants had to be male, and then they had to reverse the whole thing a generation or so later again. But up until that point, in principle, the public offices were open to anyone because it didn't say otherwise. To study Pauline translation as a seismogram produces the following picture. Gender-generic Greek was early on translated in gender-specific masculine form. In later years, we have seen many attempts to translate gender-generic Greek more generically, but also gender-specific masculine Greek into more generically inclusive form in English. It is the latter that has become controversial. I understand and agree with the criticisms raised from conservative circles, but probably for different reasons. For example, on the internet one can find various evangelical conspiracy theories along the lines that the International Bible Society holds secret plans to publish a politically correct version of the NIV. This is described in an article called Femme Fatale by Susan Olaski. So there are all sorts of these conspiracy theories out there, but as you have hopefully understood that I'm also quite critical to the gender in the inclusive language project, but more for academic reasons. What about gender-specific Greek terms? They have usually been translated gender specifically masculine too, but in a society that puts increasing weight on gender equality. This is a problem because it makes the Bible look patriarchal, dated, and out of touch with modern society. Feminist translations, like the Bibel in gerechter Sprache, goes all the way, not in order to save the face of the Bible or to cover it up, but because the translators genuinely believe that the message of the Bible is justice and freedom for all. Every translation is a new textual production that in addition reflects a certain ideology. It has to, in order to function in a given way in a given society. This is true for the Bible as for any other translated text. But since the Bible is by many thought to have its own inherent ideology and is equipped with authority beyond a particular linguistic incarnation, this can create some problems in the modern world. So it is no longer for us impossible to imagine female leaders in Pauline Christianity, and we can call them apostles if we like. And our modern translations should reflect this fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely enchanted by the very imaginative idea of our Parliament having a conversation about Unia. I just can't imagine any moment in which that could happen here. But you have given us a great deal to think about, and I think very much in the spirit of the Ethel M Wood Lecture, with its interest in Bible as Bible is Bible and Bible as artifact, I think. There's plenty of time for some questions, I think, and I have a microphone here. So does anyone have a burning question they'd like to ask while I try and turn this on?
Advocating a literal approach to translation? If you're saying a version like LRSV would be best because it enables us to see what's there in the Greek and the Hebrew, is that what you would be advocating primarily, or would you say that you need different kinds of translations for different contexts and different aims?
It probably is clear after this this lecture that if I had been asked in this SBL survey in 2010, I probably would have ended up in the more critical camp among those who think that it definitely would need some revision. Yeah, but I think that the clue there, and what was good about that survey, was that they would ask for liturgical and academic use, and I think that if you think of the Bible as a basis for a faith community and used in the liturgy, I can really see the importance of an inclusive language translation. But as a teacher of biblical studies, and especially when also trying to teach gender in the ancient world and gender in the Bible, I find these inclusive language translations very difficult to use in class, because they cover up the problems rather than, put them on display. So that I have ended up having to ask the students to consult other translations that I would not have pointed them in direction of otherwise. But I definitely think that and this is our problem in the translation committee in the Norwegian Bible Society, that not only should we make a translation that has to kind of serve all sorts of different purposes, but now it's also an ecumenical translation, so it should serve various Protestant groups and also be used in the Catholic Church of Norway. And for me, then now I'm working on, as the primary translator of the Apocrypha, the Greek Apocrypha, and some of them are rather freewheeling, shall we say, and the language, I've been translating, first translator of the Greek book of Esther, which is a relatively secular work, and I think that what has been done in previous translation is to kind of gloss it up and dress it up in biblical language, I would like to show that this is somehow it's like a court novel in many ways, and the language is such, and then you have these very kind of these letters from King Xerxes, declarations that are very solemn and very difficult to read, and all of this should be represented in the translation. But if it's all going to be readable from the pulpit in the Catholic Church, of course, the translation that I would like to make could never work in that setting. So maybe the answer is that there will just have to be different translations for different purposes.
Thank you.
So can I ask two very trivial questions from the start of your talk? And forgive me, neither has the slightest importance. Erasmus uses transfundo for translate, which is gorgeous. Transfundo. The participle was transfuse. It's gorgeous because it means to pour into. So you're pouring the text into another vessel, which has already been shaped and moulded by its history and use. But I don't think we ever think of a translation now as being a pouring of the text into another pre-shaped vessel. I just wondered if you might comment. And your other thing was, are you really telling us that Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of England, noticed 150,000 errors from the Hebrew in a translation of the Bible? I think we should have a word with our Prime Minister.
Yeah. Well, just the latter. That is a quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she was a formidable woman with formidable numbers. So this is what she said, but it definitely testifies to higher knowledge of the Bible and its translations some years ago than today. Yes, so you can have a word with your Prime Minister. When it comes to the pouring in, what I've not done today, but also written about, unfortunately in Norwegian, is how the different sacred scriptures of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam comes with each their kind of linguistic theory and each their kind of theory of translatability. And when you have an idea that the Bible can be translated, it can be poured into a different vessel and not lose its content, its meaning content. But of course, for the Quran, it could not have worked. But I didn't think of the fact that he used this term, but it perfectly illustrates a kind of Christian concept of what writing the Bible in a different language is about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting. Lots of fascinating stuff there. I'm fascinated by this whole question of what we do with Andrea and terms related to manliness and the end of 1 Corinthians, be manly, and with this, what do we do with that? Because if you translate it as just literally and in a liturgical or a faith community context, they read it, being manly, there's no way that the people in the pews, as it were, could understand all of the significance of what Andrea means in the ancient world. So how can that be communicated to them? I found when I've just recently been translating De Vita Contemplativa for the commentary on the text of Philo, and he does a lot with Andrea, and he even introduces, well, there are both therapeutai and therapeutides. There are men and women in this group, and then he talks about them as men. But it ties in with Andrea, and so I then translated it as manly people. But to tie in with the concept of Andrea, because I think it's really important in the text, had that been in the Bible, I think I would have had real trouble translating that text, thinking about how it could then be used in a liturgical context. So, yeah, I just wondered what to do, really.
Yeah, and this is what I have, what I often say, and I don't know if I skipped this section here, but or whether I read it, but that translation is based on a lot of choices, and you have, as a translator, you have to make hard choices all the time. Because when you are exegeting a text, you can always write an extra paragraph and explain, well, it's actually not this simple because so and so and so. But when you translate it, you have to go for, it's like a computer, it's 0 or 1. And you have to go for one of them, and you can't have both. And this is, of course, the difficulty. So this is why I can spend this lecture questioning and criticizing and problematizing, but of course when I go back to my translator's desk, I'll have to make those hard choices. And it's very difficult to know, because it's, as you say, when it's going to function in that kind of community, you don't want to, if 90% of the people in the pews are women, you don't want to send them out saying this is really just for men.
I mean, in the ancient world, it is better to be a man. So if you translate it, you valorize that particular concept for the community.
Yeah.
If you do it literally.
Yeah. But I also think that to say courageous is too. It's too narrow. It's too narrow, and it's more superficial in a way. And what Andrea was about, which was something I perceive as much deeper, exactly because it was tied to gender. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer, but that's kind of what it is to be a translator. You have to make hard choices, and it's going to be wrong whatever you choose.
Thank you very much indeed. You're fascinating, ranging over all sorts of areas. I think it's also interesting that there's confusion here about our political agendas, which is why I thought your Parliament example was so interesting, and our grammatical ones. So the confusion between sexual gender on the one hand and linguistic gender. So that in the example of 1 Thessalonians 2:7, where you talked about trophos, whether it's nursing mother. I mean, even though trophos is a masculine ending, the fact that it's a feminine noun is made clear in the rest of the sentence, because it's trophos thaupe ta heautes tekna. So it's the nursing her own children. It can't be a nurse of somebody else's children with heautes, I would have thought. Because that is the reflexive pronoun, the feminine pronoun, reflecting that it's really her children. So that ties it in a way that wouldn't be the case, say, for diakonos, where again you've got a masculine ending that could mean deacon, a male deacon or a female deacon. And then the other one where I'd ask the same question comes out with your comments about adelphos and adelphoi, and is brothers and sisters an accurate translation of adelphoi? And of course that's slightly muddied again by the fact that adelphos is a brother and adelphei is a sister. And so when you get into the plural, you get adelphoi for brother. Can that be your brothers and sisters more accurately than just simply only brothers? But your other point, if I may just link in with that, to that, is quite interesting, that with Stanton's criticism of the English revised version for being too masculine, of course the American Standard version of 1901 was a criticism of the fact it was too English, because the English revisers didn't adopt enough of the Americans' criticisms. And then you look at the way in which, to go back to the point about adelphos, in many of the Catholic translations, when they talk about Jesus' brothers and sisters, they're translated as cousins, in order to protect the dogma about Mary ever virgin. So you've got all sorts of political things coming in mixed in there. Is it because of gender? Is it because of which side of the Atlantic you're on? Or is it because of your church dogma about whether Jesus can have brothers and sisters or whether it's cousins? So grammar moves then into a whole range of other political issues.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for the trophos, you know, there would be little point in using the term, or not using the term for mother, if it was just her own, you know, like her own biological children. It would still kind of be the children that were kind of surrounding her. So I still that her babies there would be those who kind of are in her care. But I agree that the grammar, you know, you can't always equate grammatical gender with, you know, with kind of human gender. Although the case you mentioned about brothers, I should just specify there that the norm in the ancient world was that if a group included men and women, when you would address that, they would address it as a male. So then it's not really the grammatical form that we need to discuss per se, but you know, that can this include women or not? But it's the convention. You know, you can criticize the convention that it is the masculine form that is used, although they were aware that, you know, Paul is aware that there are women present, but he is still using the masculine form because that was the convention. So that's why I was saying that to translate then in modern brothers and sisters is in a way to read more gender into that expression, adelphoi, than probably was there when Paul was speaking, because you are in a way making that more gendered than Paul was using it. But then on the other hand, if you just say siblings, you are kind of making it weaker, the gender weaker in that. So both again both of them are not kind of optimal, but it is because of the different awareness and the political significance, if you will, of gender in our day and time that we have to make, you know, we are thinking about these things in a different way. So to hit the right pitch of the level of intention with S, as the linguists talk about, that's what is almost impossible in this case.
Thanks a lot. In your story, you know, this is a fascinating account, really, of an interaction between all these spheres and infrastructures, background knowledges, background assumptions, changing social histories, and also some things which rise to the surface, which end up being something like interventions at the level of translation, but these groups that create, in some sense, little placeholders for how we might think otherwise at a given moment in time, and that is itself an institutional history that I think is very interesting. And I just wanted to ask naively, and sorry and this is not a very good question, but what is your sense now of where we are in terms of our institutional capacities to do creative work at this kind of level? Because, I mean, even just listening to your talk, you think, oh wow, you know, in order to say anything interesting about any given moment, one could really just go off the deep end in many different respects in terms of what one would need to know. Or alternatively, if we were to think creatively about how to transform contemporary translations in order to foment certain thoughts, which otherwise might not happen, that in itself is also a fairly daunting institutional endeavor. You know, large committees, large kind of funding, and so on. do you have a sense of where we are historically? Are we at a low ebb, high ebb in terms of our capacities maybe to organize things interestingly from here?
I think we are definitely high ebb, because, but not perhaps. Biblical studies is probably in a low ebb, because languages are disappearing out, and knowledge of because of course in order to translate you have to know languages, and also the interest in the Bible in many kind of in many settings in theology programs is shrinking. That biblical studies is perhaps positions in biblical studies are being closed down and rather goes to more kind of interesting religions. So I think that this work may not be done by biblical scholars, but in general, translation is very, very big in cultural studies, and just in Oslo, there is a program on the transference of values through translation. They are working mostly with novels, literature, translating in all to and from various languages, and then you have the whole kind of technical expertise of translators working for the EU, and EU is in a way a huge translation project, and that requires a lot of study. But I think we are easily blind towards how much translation effort the EU requires, and I think that maybe many of the problems could be understood better if we had understood the significance of, for example, Greek. Just because Greek is an official EU language. Very few in Brussels can even read the Greek letters. And for many, many years, the Greeks have known this. So they send documents to Brussels knowing that few people can read them and that few people will be able to translate them. And I think that this has they have to have official translators, of course, but the fact that you cannot kind of browse through and kind of get roughly the gist of what this letter says has perhaps contributed to the situation that Greece suddenly found itself in last summer, for example. But I think that more that in other disciplines of humanities, this is there's much more awareness of translation than just a few years ago, and I hope that biblical studies will see that this is actually very, very close to home for us, because many PhDs from our programs go into Bible translation, so it's a job for many of our graduates, so it's kind of, the picture is a bit like there. So I think that biblical studies should see that they actually have a treasure here, that they should just sell to the world or whatever. I
have time for one or two more questions if anyone would like to ask anything or comment on what Lauren's been talking about. Any more questions? People pay for your aerobic exercise.
See if I can make it work this time. It's just just a simple point. I was interested that you said that you think English is a much more inclusive language, because I don't experience that as a mother tongue English speaker. For example, when I'm writing essays and I have to decide, there's no gender neutral third person, whereas in a lot of languages in the world there are. And so you always have to decide between, you've got to say he or she if you want to be inclusive, or just say she to make a point. So I don't think English is very good either, really. As I don't think it is particularly inclusive. And it does still categorise in gender terms, in the singular at least.
Yeah, it does. It has pronouns have gender, but it doesn't in the same way as some of these other European languages categorize cities or rivers or mountains or whatever with male and masculine terms. And on the one hand, you could say, well, that doesn't really mean very much, and usually it doesn't, but it does. It means that these. So, for example, the notion of land, that the land, the kind of the soil of the land, often has kind of feminine, very grammatical feminine connotations. Can exaggerate or can strengthen certain notions about land that can also be problematic, about kind of nationalist, etc., and that people are coming over our borders and violating our land, more or less like in terms of rape, for example. So sometimes this language, that's this grammatically gendered language that is just slumbering and is just there most of the time, can be activated from time to time in a way that you cannot see the same way as in English languages, at least. I'm sure that there are many other ways of getting the same ideas across, but at least it's not underscored by the structures of the language.
Logos comes to mind.
Yeah.
Lauren, thank you so much. It's a really rich experience, and I think we've all got more than enough going on to think about. Off the air, I'm reminded in the heady years of the 80s, in a religious community where the priest brother came to say the Mass first, and he said, "Brethren, let us confess our sins," and we said, "Well, anyway." Thank you very much indeed. There is, of course, a reception to be down through that door there. Please do join us for further conversation and refreshments. And we really can't thank you enough for coming and sharing such a wide and deep experience of translation, both in terms of gender and, I think, of ideology as well. Lauren, thank you very much.